"Open the door, Ethan." "Please." Wade Harlan's fist hammered the steel while Hurricane Mercy screamed over Raven Point. 7 months earlier, Wade called it a tin turtle. Now he stood soaked, breathless, and shaking outside it. Atlas, Ethan's German shepherd, blocked the threshold, amber eyes locked on the crowd behind him. "You said it would never hold," Ethan whispered. Wade swallowed. "I was wrong." Then the lights died across Marrow Creek, and the river rose again. Ethan reached for the storm bar. To understand why he opened that door, you need to know what the town did before the first bolt was ever tightened. They called it the Tin Turtle before Ethan Rourke had even finished bolting the first curved rib into the hill. Men at the gas station said it with coffee on their breath and smiles they did not bother hiding. Women at the diner repeated it over plates of eggs and biscuits. Glancing through the window, whenever his dented gray pickup rolled past with another load of salvaged steel strapped to the bed. Even Wade Harlan, who sold half the town its lumber, nails, and gossip, had leaned against the counter one humid August afternoon and laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "That veteran's building himself a metal shell up on Raven Point," he said. "Maybe he figures if he hides inside it long enough, the world will stop asking questions." Nobody corrected him. Nobody asked what kind of questions the world had already asked Ethan, or what it had taken from him before he ever came to Marrow Creek. They only saw the quiet man with the squared shoulders, the watchful eyes, and the old German shepherd that moved beside him like a shadow with a heartbeat. They saw the steel arches rising above the pines, ugly and stubborn against the Carolina sky, and decided it was easier to laugh than wonder. Raven Point had always made people uneasy. It sat above the Blackwater River on a shelf of red clay and stone, 6 acres of tall grass, loblolly pine, and broken foundations left behind by storms with pretty names and cruel hands. 3 houses had stood there over the past 20 years. 3 had failed. 1 lost its roof in a hurricane. 1 flooded from below when the river climbed higher than anyone thought it could. 1 was abandoned before the windows were even hung, its owner leaving behind a half-poured walkway and a rusted mailbox with no name. So when Ethan bought the place for $42,000 at a county tax auction, most folks took it as proof that he was either desperate, foolish, or not quite right. A man with sense did not choose land everyone else had learned to fear. A man with sense did not haul curved boatyard steel up a ridge in the hottest part of the year. A man with sense did not build a small wooden cabin and then wrap it in a skeleton of metal as if the house itself needed armor. But Ethan Rourke had never built for applause. He built the way some people prayed, quietly, carefully, with both hands and no witnesses required. Each morning, before the heat shimmered off the road, he climbed the slope with Atlas at his side. The shepherd was 8 years old, dark sable with amber eyes and one ear that tipped slightly at the end, giving him a softness his posture refused to admit. Atlas had the calm of an old soldier and the patience of a church bell. He watched the ridge. He watched Ethan. He watched the town below with the steady attention of a creature that understood danger, did not always arrive barking. Some days, when the hammer strikes rang too sharp or a gust of wind snapped a tarp like distant thunder, Ethan's breath would catch in his chest. His fingers would still around a wrench. His gaze would drift somewhere far beyond the hill, beyond the river, beyond South Carolina. Then Atlas would step close and press his head against Ethan's leg, not demanding, not dramatic, just present, and Ethan would return. One breath, then another. Down in Marrow Creek, the jokes kept traveling. Someone taped a hand-drawn turtle to the bulletin board outside the grocery store. Someone else said the county ought to inspect that bunker before it scared off tourists. Ethan heard more than they thought he did. He simply carried the words up the hill and buried them beneath work. Bolt by bolt, beam by beam, the strange house rose. A raised floor 6 feet above the ground, storm shutters thick enough to make daylight feel negotiable, rain barrels, a radio mast, solar panels, a reinforced pantry, and over it all those great steel ribs bending from earth to earth, not fighting the wind head-on, but offering it a path around. 7 months later, when Hurricane Mercy came ashore stronger than the forecast dared admit, every joke in Marrow Creek drowned before midnight. The Blackwater River climbed over its banks and rolled through Main Street like a dark animal. Power lines went dead. Porch lights vanished. Roofs groaned, sirens failed. The community hall took water through its back wall. Phones blinked out one by one. and above town on Raven Point the ugly steel arch held. Near 2 in the morning, through wind and rain hard enough to erase the world beyond the porch, Ethan heard pounding on the outer door. Atlas was already standing, ears forward, body still. Ethan lifted the storm bar and opened it. There stood the people who had laughed, soaked, shaking, stripped of pride by the sound of the river rising behind them. Wade Harlan was among them, his face pale under the emergency lantern glow, his mouth working before any words came. Ethan looked at him, then at the others, then stepped aside. "Come in," he said, and one by one, the town entered the house it had mocked. 7 months before Hurricane Mercy taught Merrow Creek the difference between foolishness and foresight, Ethan Rourke arrived with one suitcase, one toolbox, and a German shepherd who seemed to understand the town before the town understood him. It was late August, the kind of South Carolina morning that made the air feel soaked before the first drop of rain had fallen. Heat rose from the asphalt in pale waves. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like old gray curtains, and the Blackwater River moved behind Main Street with a lazy brown shine, pretending it had never swallowed a road, a porch, or a life's savings. Ethan drove slowly past the barber shop, the Methodist church, the Bates store, and the diner with its hand-painted sign that read "Bless Your Heart Cafe," though the faces in the windows offered very little blessing. He noticed without looking like he noticed. That was something the Army had trained into him years ago, and something life afterward had made permanent. He could read a room through glass, hear judgment in the pause before a greeting, feel suspicion gather like humidity around his shoulders. At 41, Ethan still carried himself like a man waiting for instructions no one would ever give again. He was tall, lean, and sun-browned, with close-cut dark hair beginning to silver at the temples and eyes the color of rainwater over stone. His left hand rested at the bottom of the steering wheel, steady but tense. His right hand dropped once briefly to the bottom of the head of the dog beside him. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, his sable coat brushed but scarred in places beneath the fur, his amber eyes moving from storefront to sidewalk to rearview mirror. He did not bark, he did not whine, he simply watched, as if the town were a trail he had not yet decided was safe. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though he was not sure which one of them needed the word more. Atlas turned his head just enough to touch his nose to Ethan's wrist. That was his answer. They had been together for almost 6 years, first under orders, then by choice. Atlas had worked beside Ethan overseas, searching roads, warehouses, and silent fields where every ordinary object had to be treated like a question. Later, after discharge papers and hospital hallways, and the strange humiliation of being thanked for service by people who stepped away when he flinched, Ethan fought for months to adopt him. Some people said a working dog should be retired into a proper home. Ethan had smiled at that thinly. Proper homes had walls. What he and Atlas had was loyalty, which had proved stronger. Merrow Creek was not meant to be a destination. It was supposed to be a quiet dot on a map, a place with low taxes, cheap land, and enough distance from major highways that no one would ask him what he was doing with the rest of his life. He had seen the county auction listing at 2 in the morning during one of those sleepless stretches when the dark seemed too crowded to close his eyes. 6 acres on Raven Point, existing foundations, river view, sold as $42,000. The price was low enough to be dangerous. The photographs were worse. Waist-high grass, cracked concrete, a collapsed shed, pine roots lifting through old brick like fingers prying open a secret. But then Ethan saw the name in the attached deed history, Thomas Rourke. His grandfather had mentioned that name once, maybe twice, always with the tired softness people use for family stories that ended before anyone thought to write them down. A brother who went south, a boatyard, a storm, then nothing. Ethan stared at the screen until dawn paled behind the blinds. By noon, he had called the county office. By the end of the week, Raven Point was his. Now, as his truck rolled into Merrow Creek, he felt the old unease shift inside him. Not fear exactly, but the careful tightening that came before a test. At the general store, an older man stopped sweeping and watched the pickup pass. At the diner, 2 women leaned closer to the window. A man pumping gas gave Atlas a long look, then gave Ethan a longer one. Ethan had seen that look in airports. Clinics, grocery aisles, waiting rooms. The look that tried to be polite while measuring the distance to the nearest exit. It said veteran without saying thank you. It said dog without saying companion. It said something happened to him, and then, worse, maybe something is wrong with him. Ethan turned off Main Street toward Harlan Supply, parked beneath a faded awning, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The engine ticked softly. Cicadas buzzed from the ditch grass. Atlas leaned against his shoulder, warm and solid. Ethan exhaled through his nose, slow enough to count. "New start," he said quietly. Atlas blinked once, patient as scripture. Then Ethan opened the door, stepped into the heat, and walked toward the first room in Marrow Creek that would decide what kind of man it thought he was. Harlan Supply smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and old coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. A bell above the door gave a tired jingle when Ethan stepped inside, Atlas close to his left leg. 3 men near the paint aisle stopped talking. Not all at once, not rudely enough to be called rude, but enough for the silence to change shape. Behind the counter stood Wade Harlan, broad through the chest, red-faced from years of sun, with a silver mustache trimmed so neatly it looked like another rule he expected the world to follow. He glanced first at Ethan, then at Atlas, then at the faded service patch on Ethan's canvas bag. "Help you?" Wade asked. The words were ordinary. The tone was not. Ethan moved to the counter and unfolded the county map he had printed before the drive. Looking for the best road up to Raven Point. Wade's eyebrows lifted. One of the men behind Ethan gave a low whistle. "Raven Point," Wade repeated, as if tasting something sour. "You the fellow bought that tax parcel?" "Yes, sir." "Well," Wade said, leaning back, "that explains the dog." Ethan did not answer. Atlas sat without command, still as a carved shadow, his amber eyes fixed somewhere just below Wade's chin. He was not threatening. He was not nervous. That made people more nervous than barking would have. "That land's got history," Wade went on. "Bad drainage, worse wind. River climbs higher than it should when a storm backs water in. Last man who tried building up there left half his roof in a neighbor's soybean field." A couple of men chuckled. Ethan kept his hand flat on the map. "I read the records. Records don't teach common sense." Wade tapped the counter with 2 fingers. "You military?" Ethan looked up. "I was, thought so." Wade's eyes moved again to Atlas. "That one military too?" "Retired." "Uh-huh." The pause that followed was small, but it carried weight. Ethan had heard pauses like that in pharmacy lines and motel lobbies. After someone noticed the way he chose a chair facing the door. After a slammed car trunk made his shoulders tighten. People rarely said the ugly thing outright. They wrapped it in concern, polished it with manners, then set it down between you like a glass of water nobody asked for. Wade lowered his voice just enough to pretend kindness. "Look, this is a quiet town. Folks here don't need trouble. We don't need somebody going up on that ridge, building who knows what, making people wonder." Ethan folded the map once, carefully. "I'm not here to make people wonder." "No?" Wade gave a dry smile. "You show up alone with a service dog and buy the strangest piece of land in the county. Wondering is what people do." Something tightened behind Ethan's ribs, not anger. Anger was too hot, too easy. This was older, colder, the feeling of being reduced to the worst thing people imagined about him. Atlas leaned his shoulder against Ethan's knee. Just enough pressure, just enough truth. Ethan breathed in slow, cedar dust, coffee. Heat through the front windows. "Here, not there. Now, not then." "I need the road," Ethan said. Wade studied him for another second, then pointed toward the map. "County 18 until the pavement quits. Left at the old fire tower. After that, it's clay and ruts." "Don't say I didn't warn you." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." As he turned to leave, one of the men near the paint aisle muttered, not softly enough, "Raven Point finally found somebody strange enough to match it." The others laughed under their breath. Ethan walked on. Atlas walked with him. Outside, the heat hit hard, bright and wet. Ethan stopped beside the truck and stared across Main Street, where the diner windows flashed with reflected sun and curious faces quickly looked away. For a moment, the town seemed less like a place and more like a verdict already written. Atlas nudged his hand. Ethan looked down. The dog's eyes were calm, steady, faithful in a way no human room had ever managed to be. "Just us," Ethan whispered. Then he opened the truck door. "That's still enough." The road to Raven Point stopped pretending to be a road about 2 miles after the old fire tower. Pavement gave way to red clay, then red clay gave way to twin ruts baked hard by sun and split open by summer rain. Ethan drove in low gear, the truck rocking gently as pine branches brushed the doors and grass scraped along the undercarriage. Atlas stood with his front paws braced on the floorboard, nose lifted toward the open window, reading the ridge through scent long before Ethan could see it. The air changed first. Down in Marrow Creek, the heat smelled like asphalt, river mud, and fried food drifting from the diner vents. Up here it smelled of pine sap, rust, wild blackberry, and old wood left too long in weather. Then the trees thinned and Raven Point opened before them. Ethan eased the truck to a stop. For a while he did not get out. 6 acres spread across the ridge in rough, uneven light, sloping toward a view of the Blackwater River, twisting below like a dark ribbon dragged through the county. It should have been beautiful. Maybe it was. But beauty was not the first thing Ethan noticed. He noticed the scars. A cracked foundation sat half-swallowed by weeds near the rise. Its concrete split clean through as if the earth had taken a slow breath and broken it. Farther down, 4 porch posts leaned at odd angles, holding up nothing but air. A rusted rain barrel lay on its side beneath a live oak, and a row of bricks disappeared into the grass, marking where a walkway had once tried to lead someone home. Atlas jumped down when Ethan opened the door, landing with a soft thud. He did not run. He circled once, ears forward, tail low, then looked back at Ethan as if asking whether this was the place or the warning. "Both, maybe," Ethan said. His voice sounded smaller up here. The wind moved constantly across Raven Point, not strong yet, but restless, sliding over the ridge and through the grass with a dry whisper. Ethan walked to the nearest foundation and knelt. He brushed dirt from the concrete, studying the old anchor holes, the way the previous walls had been squared directly toward the river. A straight wall took the storm like a chest taking a fist. A flat roof invited the wind to lift. Whoever built here before had built as if the weather could be ordered to behave. Ethan knew better. He had spent years watching temporary shelters fail for the same reason proud men failed. They stood too rigid against what was bigger than them. Atlas barked once from beyond the live oak, not alarm, discovery. Ethan stood and followed him through knee-high grass to a shallow rock pocket near the edge of the property. Atlas had his nose pressed to something half-buried beneath vines. Ethan cleared away leaves and found a metal box, rusted orange at the seams, heavy enough that it seemed reluctant to return to daylight. The latch broke when he worked it open. Inside were oil-stained papers wrapped in a brittle grocery bag, a few old photographs, and a carpenter's pencil worn almost to nothing. Ethan unfolded the first sheet carefully. Lines, measurements, curves. Not a house plan exactly. More like the beginning of an argument with the wind. Across the top, in faded block letters, someone had written, "Rourke and Whitaker Boatworks, Storm Shelter Concept." Ethan's throat tightened before he understood why. Thomas Rourke, the name from the deed. The family ghost who had gone south and vanished into a story nobody finished. There were notes in the margin. Raised floor, ship ribs, wind passage, anchor to stone, don't trap pressure. Then one sentence, written darker than the rest, as if the hand had pressed hard enough to leave it behind for someone. Don't build against the storm. Give it somewhere to go. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. Atlas sat beside him, panting softly in the heat, patient while something old and unnamed shifted in the air between man, dog, and land. Ethan looked from the paper to the broken foundations, then to the river below. He could almost see it now. Not a bunker, not a box, not a house daring the storm to come straight on. A small cabin raised above floodwater. A curved steel frame over it like the ribs of an overturned boat, space for the wind to split and slide. Anchors sunk into the stone beneath the clay. Ugly, maybe. Strange, certainly. But alive in the way practical things were alive. He stood slowly, holding the papers with both hands, and for the first time since crossing into Marrow Creek, he felt something inside him loosen. Not happiness, not yet. Something quieter. Recognition. Atlas nudged his leg and Ethan looked down with the faintest smile. "Looks like we didn't just buy land," he said. "We found instructions." The next morning, Ethan walked into Harlan's Supply with Thomas Rourke's old drawings folded inside a manila envelope and a list written in pencil on the back of a grocery receipt. Atlas followed at his heel, calm as sunrise, though every head in the store turned before the bell above the door had finished ringing. Wade Harlan was at the counter, arguing with a farmer about fence posts. But the moment he saw Ethan, his mouth settled into the kind of smile men use when they already have an audience. "Well now," Wade said, loud enough for the paint aisle to hear. "Raven Point's back." Ethan placed the list on the counter. I need pricing on galvanized fasteners, concrete anchors, pressure-treated beams, storm shutters, and curved steel if you can order it." Wade looked down, then back up slowly. "Curved steel?" A man near the seed rack laughed into his coffee. Ethan kept his voice even. "Rib sections, 40 feet long if possible. Shorter pieces can work if they're clean." Wade picked up the paper as if it might stain his fingers. "You building a house or a turtle shell?" This time the laugh moved through the store like a match catching dry grass. Ethan felt it touch the back of his neck, hot and familiar. He did not look around. Atlas shifted closer, his shoulder brushing Ethan's leg. It was a small thing, but it held the room in place. Wade leaned over the counter. "Listen, I don't know what kind of emergency bunker you sketched up there, but specialty steel like this isn't cheap. Freight alone will eat you alive. And even if you get it, you'll need equipment, permits, inspections, help." He paused, letting the last word hang. "You got help?" Ethan thought of the ridge, the broken foundations, the old sentence pressed hard into yellowing paper. "Give it somewhere to go. I'll manage." "That's what worries folks," Wade said. "Men who say they'll manage usually don't ask until something's already gone wrong." The words were dressed as concern, but Ethan heard the hook beneath them. For a second, he wanted to explain. He wanted to tell Wade that he had built water systems in desert heat, reinforced shelters with half the materials promised and twice the weather expected, and learned the hard way that nature did not care how confident a man sounded. But explanation had never cured contempt. So he folded his receipt, nodded once, and said, "Thank you for checking." Wade blinked, surprised by the quiet. Ethan turned to leave. Behind him, someone muttered, "Tin turtle," and the room chuckled again. Outside, his receipt nodded. The sun struck hard against the windshield. Ethan stood beside his truck, one hand on the door, waiting for the tightness in his chest to loosen. Atlas looked up at him, then toward the river road, ears lifting. "What?" Ethan asked. Atlas gave one soft huff and started walking, not wandering, leading. Ethan followed because Atlas had never wasted urgency. The dog led him past the bait shop, across a cracked side street, and down toward the old industrial bend, where the river widened behind a row of abandoned sheds. A faded sign swung from one chain at the gate, Whitaker Yard. Most of the letters had peeled away, but below them, almost hidden under rust, Ethan saw another line, Rourke and Whitaker Boat Works. His breath left him slowly. The gate was unlocked. Beyond it lay a graveyard of forgotten labor. Boat frames, steel ribs, long beams stacked under torn tarps, sheets of corrugated metal, coils of cable, crates of bolts sealed in dust. Atlas moved to a covered rack and pawed once at the ground. Ethan pulled back the tarp, curved steel, dozens of sections, weathered but sound, shaped like the bones of some sleeping whale. For a long moment, Ethan did not move. The town had laughed because it could only see junk, oddness, a man dragging the past behind him. But here, under rust and river heat, lay the beginning of the thing he had seen in his mind. Not a bunker, not a joke, a shelter. He returned to the county office that afternoon and filed the salvage claim properly. The clerk, a tired woman with kind eyes, checked the records and told him the yard had been abandoned for years. "You haul it, you own it," she said. $3,800 for the lot. Ethan paid with hands that stayed steady only because Atlas sat beside his chair. When they drove back to Raven Point near sunset, the first load of steel groaned in the truck bed. Down below, Marrow Creek glittered soft and unaware beside the Blackwater River. Ethan looked at the ridge ahead, then at Atlas. "They gave it a name," he said quietly. "Tin Turtle." Atlas blinked. Ethan almost smiled. "Let's build it anyway." By the third week on Raven Point, Ethan's hands looked like the land itself, creased, reddened, rough at the edges, and holding together anyway. Every morning began before the sun cleared the pines. He would boil coffee on a camp stove, pour half into a dented travel mug, and stand beside the unfinished foundation, while Atlas made his first slow patrol of the property. The shepherd moved with purpose, nose low through the grass, pausing at the stacked steel, the tool crate, the water barrels, the edge of the ridge where the wind always arrived first. Ethan used to smile at that, then he stopped calling it habit. Atlas was not wandering, he was working. The first ribs went up ugly. There was no poetry in a steel beam fighting gravity, no music in a socket wrench slipping under sweaty fingers, no romance in red clay sticking to boots until each step felt borrowed from someone stronger. Ethan built alone because help had not been offered, and because asking still felt like standing bare beneath fluorescent lights while strangers decided how broken he was. He measured twice, sometimes 3 times, then drilled the anchor points deep into the old stone beneath the clay. He raised the cabin floor 6 feet off the ground on reinforced posts, not because it looked good, but because river water did not care about beauty. He set cross braces where Thomas Rourke's faded notes had suggested ship logic, then added his own improvements from years of field construction. Pressure vents beneath the eaves, a utility wall sealed above flood height, a hand-crank radio shelf, hooks for lanterns, storage benches wide enough for supplies, and a small sleeping nook near the front door where Atlas could rest and still hear everything. Down below, the town kept laughing. The nickname traveled faster than the work, the Tin Turtle. Someone painted it on a scrap of plywood and leaned it against the road one afternoon. Ethan found it when he drove back from the county office with a load of concrete mix. He stopped the truck, stared at the sign, and for a moment something old and tired moved across his face. Not shame exactly. Shame required believing they were right. This was weariness, the kind that settled into a man when he understood he could do everything carefully and still be misunderstood casually. Atlas jumped from the cab, walked to the sign, sniffed it once, then looked up at Ethan as if waiting for orders. Ethan picked up the board, laid it in the truck bed, and later used it as temporary backing for a pantry shelf. The words faced the wall. The work faced the storm. Some afternoons, Mara Whitfield came up the ridge with cold lemonade, library books about coastal engineering, and a way of speaking that never stepped too close to pity. She did not ask Ethan what happened overseas. She did not ask why loud sounds made him turn his head before anyone else did. She asked why the arch leaned at that angle, why the floor joists were doubled, why the cabin sat inside the frame instead of under it. Ethan answered because her questions treated his mind like a place worth entering. "The wind needs a path," he told her one evening, tightening a bolt while thunder muttered far off beyond the river. "Flat walls make it argue. Curves let it pass." Mara looked up at the steel ribs catching the orange light. Sounds like people could learn from that. Ethan did not answer, but the words stayed with him. Then came the hard days, the ones that found cracks no building plan could mark. A dropped sheet of metal cracked against stone, sharp and sudden, and Ethan was gone before he moved, back inside dust, heat, alarms, voices folding into one another. His knees bent, his breath locked. The wrench fell from his hand. Atlas crossed the ground in 3 strides and pressed his body against Ethan's chest, heavy, warm, real. Ethan gripped the shepherd's collar, eyes shut, counting into the fur, one breath, then another, pine sap, river wind, Carolina heat. Atlas, here. When he opened his eyes, the ridge had returned, so he kept building, not because he was healed. Healing was not a door a man walked through once. It was a board laid down each morning over the same dark water. By late October, the arch stood complete, silver-gray against the sky, strange and steady. The cabin glowed inside it at dusk like a lantern cupped in 2 steel hands. Ethan stood beside Atlas and looked at what they had made. For the first time in years, he did not feel like he had come somewhere to disappear. He felt, quietly and without announcement, that he had begun to remain. The first warning came on a Tuesday morning, folded into the ordinary noise of Merrow Creek, so quietly that most people mistook it for weather. A radio host out of Charleston mentioned a tropical system gathering strength over warm Atlantic water, then moved on to traffic, college football, and a sale at a furniture warehouse. At Bless Your Heart Cafe, no one looked up from their biscuits. At Harlan Supply, Wade Harlan told a customer they had lived through worse than some swirl on a screen. Even the Blackwater River seemed lazy that day, sliding under the bridge with a brown, sleepy patience that made danger feel almost insulting. But Ethan Rourke had learned a long time ago that trouble often began politely. It did not always kick in the door. Sometimes it arrived as a number dropping on a barometer, a wind shift before sunset, a line of clouds too smooth at the edge. He stood inside the steel arch with a pencil behind his ear, studying printed maps spread across his workbench. Atlas lay near the open door, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but ears awake. Ethan traced the storm track with one finger, Hurricane Mercy. The name looked gentle in black ink. That bothered him. Gentle names made people careless. By Thursday, Mercy had strengthened. By Friday, the forecast cone bent toward the Carolina coast, and Ethan drove down to the county office, then to the library, then finally to the town meeting room behind Marrow Creek Methodist, where 20 or so adults had gathered under buzzing fluorescent lights and the smell of old carpet. Wade stood near the front with a clipboard, speaking in the easy voice of a man who liked being believed. "We'll put sandbags at the south end of Main," he said. "The community hall will open if needed, same as always." Ethan waited until the room settled, then stepped forward. He had not planned a speech. Speeches made people look at him too closely. But the maps in his hand felt heavier than his discomfort. "This one isn't tracking like the others," he said. Several heads turned. A few faces tightened in that familiar way, as if his voice itself was an interruption. Wade's smile thinned. "You a meteorologist now, Rourke?" "No." Ethan unfolded the first map and pinned it to the corkboard with a thumbtack. "I'm reading water levels, tide timing, and wind direction. If Mercy turns inland during high tide, the river backs up, not just rises, pushes backward." Silas Boone, seated in the second row with his cane across his knees, leaned forward. Mara Whitfield stopped writing notes. Wade crossed his arms. Ethan tapped a shaded portion of the map. "Main Street sits in the bowl. The community hall is higher, but not enough if the west drainage fails. You should stage supplies on the Ridge Road and clear a route to Raven Point." A murmur moved through the room. Not fear yet, resistance, pride defending itself. "Raven Point," Wade said, and a few people gave tired little laughs. "Of course," Ethan looked at him. "It's above the flood line. It's also your place. It's a place that can hold people dry if other plans fail." Wade turned toward the room, palms open. "Folks, we appreciate concern truly. But Mr. Rourke has been here, 7 months? Some of us have watched that river our whole lives." Ethan felt the old heat rise in his chest, the useless desire to make them understand before time made understanding expensive. Atlas, who had been waiting by the door, stood suddenly and looked toward the windows. A gust rattled the glass, small but sharp. No one noticed except Mara. Ethan lowered his voice. "I don't need to be right. I need you ready in case I am." That should have been enough. It was not. The meeting ended with familiar decisions: sandbags, batteries, plywood, the community hall. People filed past Ethan with polite nods that said they had heard him and chosen not to listen. Outside, the evening air pressed warm and wet against the skin. The sky over the river had turned the color of old pewter. Mara came out last, carrying his maps. "I made copies," she said, "for the library, the clinic, and Silas." Ethan took them, surprised by the steadiness in her face. "You believe me?" She looked toward the darkening road where wind moved through the moss in long, nervous fingers. "I believe people laugh when they're scared of admitting someone else may see what they missed." Atlas stepped beside Ethan and faced the river. Far off, thunder rolled without rain. Down in town, porch lights clicked on, friars hissed, doors opened and closed, and Marrow Creek kept pretending the night was ordinary. Ethan looked up toward Raven Point, where the steel arch waited in the last light, like a question the town had not yet learned how to answer. Hurricane Mercy arrived after sunset, not like a visitor, not like a warning, but like the whole Atlantic had leaned its shoulder into the coast and kept pushing. By 8 o'clock, rain moved sideways through Marrow Creek in silver sheets so thick the streetlights became pale smudges behind the glass. By 9, the Blackwater River had climbed over the lower boat ramp and begun licking at the parking lot behind the bait shop. By 10, power snapped out across Main Street, 1 block at a time, until the town that had always trusted porch lights and familiar roads found itself reduced to flashlights, radio static, and the sound of water going places water had no right to go. Up on Raven Point, Ethan Rourke stood inside the steel arch with a headlamp strapped over his brow and Atlas beside him, steady as a second heartbeat. The cabin around them trembled, but it did not panic. The curved ribs groaned in the wind, a deep metallic sound, more like an old ship answering waves than a house begging to stay alive. Rain hammered the outer shell. Gusts struck the arch and slid away, roaring along both sides, searching for a flat wall to punish and finding none. Ethan moved through his checklist without hurry because hurry wasted breath. Storm shutters locked, battery bank green, hand crank radio working, pantry sealed, water barrels strapped, medical kit on the bench, lanterns ready. Atlas followed every movement, ears forward, eyes alert, occasionally turning toward the door before Ethan heard anything at all. Around midnight, the radio broke through the static with a county alert. Rapid river rise, roads closed, Residents in low-lying areas advised to move to higher ground if safe. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second, not in satisfaction. There was no satisfaction in being right, when being right meant people were scared. He opened them again when Atlas stood. The shepherd faced the outer door, body still, nose lifted. Ethan heard it then, not the wind, not rain, not the groan of branches, but a human sound beneath it all. Pounding. 3 uneven blows against steel. Ethan lifted the storm bar and opened the reinforced door just wide enough for the lantern light to spill out. Silas Boone stood on the landing, soaked through, one hand gripping the rail. His wife Ruth tucked close beside him under a plastic poncho that had already given up. Behind them were Mara Whitfield, 2 nurses from the clinic, the owner of the diner, an older couple from Riverbend Lane, and 3 more neighbors Ethan recognized mostly from the backs of heads turning away in stores. Their faces were gray with rain and fear. No one laughed, no one said Tin Turtle. Mara's voice shook, but her eyes held. The community hall is taking water through the back wall. We brought who we could. Ethan stepped aside immediately. Come in. Atlas backed up, giving them room, watching each person cross the threshold as if counting them into safety. The cabin filled with wet shoes, trembling hands whispered thanks, and the sharp scent of rain-soaked clothes. Ethan pointed without raising his voice. Blankets in the bench, dry towels under the table. Ruth, sit nearest the interior wall. Mara, help me get names. The work steadied everyone. Fear liked empty space. Ethan gave it tasks. Then came another pounding, harder this time, almost lost beneath a gust that made the arch sing. Atlas moved first, low and fast to the door, but stopped when Ethan touched his shoulder. Together they opened it. Wade Harlan stood outside under the lantern glow, water running from the brim of his cap, his face stripped of every easy joke he had ever worn. Behind him were more adults from town, breathless from the climb, carrying radios, medicine bags, and grocery sacks packed in panic. Wade looked past Ethan into the dry, lit cabin, then up at the steel ribs holding firm above them. His mouth opened, closed, then found only the truth. Ethan, he said, voice rough. We didn't know where else to go. For 1 long second, the storm seemed to wait with them. Ethan could have reminded him. He could have named every laugh, every mutter, every look that had treated him like a warning sign instead of a man. But Atlas pressed against his leg, warm and present, and Ethan remembered the sentence in Thomas Rourke's papers. Give it somewhere to go. Maybe that was true of more than wind. Ethan stepped back from the door. Then you came to the right place. Wade lowered his head and entered. Outside Hurricane Head and entered. Outside Hurricane Mercy threw its full weight against Raven Point. Inside the strange house held, and for the first time, so did the town. Inside the arch, the storm became something that could be heard but not obeyed. It roared over the steel ribs, shoved rain against the shutters, and dragged tree limbs across the outer shell with a long, scraping cry. Yet the cabin held its warm yellow center like a hand cupped around a match. 23 adults sat, stood, leaned, or knelt wherever space allowed. Water dripped from sleeves and pant legs. Shoes lined the entry on a rubber mat Ethan had laid down months earlier when no one understood why he needed one so large. Blankets moved from hand to hand. Mara wrote names on a legal pad. Silas cranked the radio with slow, careful turns. Ruth Boone sat nearest the interior wall with Atlas at her feet, one trembling hand resting on the shepherd's head as if he were the only familiar thing left in the county. I used to cross the street when I saw you, she whispered to him, her voice almost lost beneath the rain. Atlas only blinked and leaned gently into her knee. Ethan heard it but did not turn. He was at the workbench, turning the room into a system because systems were mercy when fear had too much room. Mara, mark who needs medication. Walt, check the water jugs. Denise, towels are in the lower cabinet. Wade, take that lantern and inspect the back seal every 15 minutes. If you see water coming in, call me. Wade Harlan stared at him, surprised not by the order but by the trust inside it. Then he nodded and took the lantern. No one argued. That was the first miracle of the night. The second was quieter. People began to look around. Not at the storm, not at their soaked clothes, but at the house itself. They saw the labels on shelves, the evacuation map pinned beside the radio, the first aid kit mounted where anyone could reach it, the benches that opened into storage, the elevated floor, the bolts sunk through steel plates into the ridge stone. The Tin Turtle was not madness. It was memory disciplined into wood and metal. It was every warning Ethan had not been able to make them hear made visible. Wade stood near the rear wall, lantern lifted, studying the curved frame. His face had changed. Without the easy smirk, he looked older, almost tired enough to be honest. "You built all this by yourself?" he asked. Ethan checked the radio battery. Atlas helped. A few people gave small, nervous laughs, but not the cruel kind. The sound faded into something softer when they saw Ethan's hand drop briefly to the dog's back. Mara looked up from the legal pad. "He means it." Ethan did not explain further. He did not tell them how many nights Atlas woke him before the dreams could swallow him whole. How many mornings the dog had walked the perimeter before Ethan trusted himself to pick up a drill. How many times a wet nose against his wrist had returned him to the present. Some truths were too large for crowded rooms. Near 2:30, the radio cracked with a broken report. "Road south of Maine underwater. County response delayed. Residents advised to remain in secure shelter." A silence followed, heavy and collective. In that silence, the town finally understood the shape of what it had almost lost by refusing to listen. Denise, the diner owner, pressed a towel to her face and began to cry without sound. Silas removed his cap. Wade lowered the lantern. "Ethan," he said, and the room turned with the word. He swallowed. "I was wrong." Ethan looked at him then. Not sharply, not triumphantly, just looked. Wade's voice roughened. "I made you into a story before I knew yours. That wasn't right." Outside, Mercy struck the arch with another violent gust, and the steel answered with a deep, steady hum. Ethan rested one hand on the workbench, feeling the vibration move through the wood. "You weren't the only one," he said. "No," Mara said quietly, "but he can be the first to say it." Ruth's hand stilled on Atlas' head. Someone near the pantry murmured, "I'm sorry," then another. Not loud, not dramatic, just words finally finding the courage to stand upright. Ethan's throat tightened in a way the storm could not explain. For months, he had thought he was building a place to keep the weather out. But as the people of Marrow Creek sat together beneath the arch, ashamed, grateful, frightened, and alive, he realized the house had done something harder. It had made room for them to become better than they had been. By dawn, Hurricane Mercy had weakened into a gray, exhausted rain, but Marrow Creek looked as if the night had emptied its pockets across every street. Branches lay tangled over sidewalks. Storefront signs hung crooked. The Blackwater River, swollen and brown, moved through the lower end of town with a slow, guilty silence, as though even the water understood it had gone too far. Up on Raven Point, the steel arch stood wet and scarred, streaked with leaves, mud, and river spray carried by the wind, but still upright. Still sheltering, still there. Ethan opened the outer door and stepped onto the landing with Atlas beside him. For a moment, no one spoke. The adults who had spent the night inside followed slowly, blinking into the pale morning light, their faces hollowed by fear and softened by gratitude. They looked down at Marrow Creek, then back at the strange house they had mocked. And something passed through the group that was not quite shame and not yet forgiveness. It was recognition. Wade Harlan stood a few feet behind Ethan, his cap twisted in both hands. The man who had once filled rooms with jokes now seemed unsure how to occupy the quiet. He looked at the arch, at the bolts sunk deep into stone, at the cabin raised above the floodline, then finally at Ethan. "I laughed because it was easier than admitting I didn't understand," Wade said. Ethan kept his eyes on the town below. "Most people do." Wade flinched, not because the words were cruel, but because they were fair. "I'm sorry." Ethan turned then. Atlas sat between them, calm and watchful, his wet fur catching the weak light. "Then help me make sure nobody has to climb this hill in the dark again." 3 weeks later, Marrow Creek was still drying out. Fans hummed in storefronts. Volunteers carried boxes of canned food, tarps, batteries, and medicine through the community hall, which now had a Blue County inspection notice taped to its door. People moved slower, spoke softer, and looked at one another longer than they used to. The storm had taken comfort from them, but it had given back a kind of humility. Wade came to Raven Point every morning after opening Harlan's supply. At first, he brought materials without charging delivery. Then he brought 2 workers. Then he brought coffee and stood beside Ethan at the workbench, studying the plans with the seriousness of a student who had arrived late but meant to learn. Mara organized a town meeting at the library, not to praise Ethan, though people tried, but to plan. Ethan hated the attention. His hands tightened around the edge of the podium, until Atlas leaned against his leg beneath the table. So Ethan did what he knew how to do. He taught. He explained flood lines, storm surge, wind pressure, raised floors, emergency radio placement, shared supply rooms, and why a shelter was not a symbol of fear, but a promise of care. A community doesn't become strong because nothing bad happens to it, he told them. It becomes strong when people prepare for each other before they have to. No one laughed. By the next hurricane season, 9 small Rourke storm arches stood across the county, near the clinic, behind the Methodist church, beside the fire station, on the Ridge Road, and at the edge of 2 farming communities that had always been last on every repair list. They were not beautiful in the way postcards were beautiful. They were practical, rounded, bolted down, stocked, labeled, and open to anyone who needed them. The first one on Raven Point received a new Woodson sign carved by Silas Boone and painted by Mara in deep blue letters, Atlas House. Ethan argued against it. Atlas accepted with dignity, mostly because the ceremony included a bowl of roast beef someone had brought from the diner. Years passed. Storms came and went. Some were mild, some were not. But each time the sky darkened and the river grew restless, Marrow Creek no longer wasted its first breath on denial. It checked on neighbors, it opened shelters. It remembered the night pride nearly cost them more than property. Atlas grew slower, his muzzle silvering, his patrols shorter, but no less serious. On his last summer afternoon, he lay beneath the shadow of the arch while Ethan sat beside him, one hand resting in the old shepherd's fur. The town later placed a small plaque near the door. Atlas, he stood watch before we knew we needed saving. And when Ethan Rourke was gone many years after that, they buried him on Raven Point, beside the dog who had brought him back to the world one breath at a time. People still came to touch the steel ribs and read the names. Some houses are built to keep out storms. This one did something greater. It taught a town how to let people in. If this story touched you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me which moment stayed with you most. And before you go, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far Atlas House has traveled.